So this week we're going to read a story about a lady, a Navajo Native American woman who makes something out of her goat's fur, and it will go through the steps she takes to do that. Just like we've done before, I'm going to go over the vocabulary words for the week with you really quickly. I'm also going to read a little story about another group of people that make something called a quilt, which is a blanket where you take different pieces of fabric and you make a blanket. So the first word for the week is yarn. And yarn is something, it's a material that's made out of cotton or wool. So cotton is picked from a plant and wool comes from either a sheep or a goat. And yarn is the strings, you can kind of see pictures here, made from that. We've used yarn in class when we made the yarn connector in the beginning of the year when you had to say something that you liked about yourself. We held yarn. We've also used yarn in math as well. Second word is strands. So the strands are the single pieces of the thread or the string. So there might be a whole bunch. See how these ones are thicker and these ones are skinnier? So these are strands, and then they put them together to make something thicker. They're those individual pieces. The next word is spinning. So this spinning means twisting together materials to make yarn or thread. So in the olden days, people used a spinning wheel where they would take big chunks of the yarn and they would put it in the spinning wheel and it would spin it and it would form threads of yarn. So a single thing of yarn. Now we have machines that do that, but there might be some cultures out there still that prefer to use these spinning wheels. 4 is dye, and if you notice, this dye is DYE, which is different than the other. This kind of dye means that you're taking a substance and you're using that to change the color of something. So we a lot of times think of tie-dye. So we think about like taking a white shirt and then dyeing it a different color. So putting it in dye to turn it a different color. 5 is weave. And this weave is to make cloth by crossing materials over one another. So this type of weave makes me think of like a braid. So you're putting materials over to make like a straw hat or a basket, something like that. 6 is sharpening. So sharpening means making something have a sharper edge or point. So like when we use the pencil sharpener at school, we use it because our pencil has gotten flat and we want it to be pointy. No, this one is duplicated. Duplicated means to have made an exact copy of something else. So to duplicate something means like I take a piece of paper and I'm going to make another one that looks exactly like it. And 8 is delicious. I'm pretty sure you all know this word. So delicious means something that tastes very good. So your favorite food, something that you really love to eat. So right now I'm gonna read this story. It's really small. You don't need to follow along. I just wanted to read it to you to give you a little background knowledge of another cultural group that also makes blankets. So it says, nothing but a quilt. Many people dream of getting rich or becoming famous in the blink of an eye. It usually doesn't happen that quickly, though. It took many years for one group of artists to become famous. The Gee's Bend quilters never imagined they were artists. These humble women thought their artwork was nothing but a quilt. They just stitched together scraps of fabric to make blankets so they could keep their families warm. Their quilts were never ordinary, though. These quilters used a special way of quilting that was invented by African slaves. Before the Civil War, African slaves on southern plantations worked from sunup to sundown. The women cooked delicious meals for wealthy white farmers and cleaned their grand houses. They also spent hours sharpening scissors and spinning thread for making the farmers fancy clothes. Using these skills to weave fine cloth or sew beautiful things for their own families was usually forbidden. Slaves had to make do with leftovers. To make clothes and goods for their own households, slave women used whatever they could find. They collected feed sacks, rags, and small strands or threads of yarn. They used dye or paint to color the strips. Then they stitched the different colored pieces together. The shapes and colors of these string quilts reminded the slaves of designs on fabrics from their homelands in Africa. The quilters of Gee's Bend never went to art school or to museums, so they never saw other people's designs. Their ideas for designs came from events that happened around them and from nature's wonders. One woman sewed a starry Milky Way quilt. Another made a memory quilt for from her dead husband's denim overalls. Even after all the slaves were freed, the quilters of Gee's Bend kept on making quilts. Their daughters and granddaughters kept quilting too. One day, an art collector came to Gee's Bend and bought some of these unusual quilts. Soon the women's work were hanging in museums. Today, their original designs and even duplicated copies sell for thousands of dollars. To the quilters, this adventure seems like a dream. Even if the fame and money vanishes tomorrow, they say, they'll still love making beautiful quilts. So, a lot of times quilts are handed down. It's something that maybe someone in your family makes and gives to you, and then you keep it and you might give it to your own children. I have a quilt in my bedroom that my aunt made me when I graduated high school. It was the tradition in our family that when you graduate high school, someone in your family makes a quilt for you. So I have a quilt that she made for me in my room. Okay, so going to the story for the week. This week we're going to be thinking about conclusions. So we all know a conclusion is something that happens at the end of our writing, but we also do something where we have to draw conclusions. So drawing a conclusion means that when we're reading, we're asking ourselves questions about details that are in the words and pictures. Maybe the author's not saying exactly what needs to be said, so you're going to have to make some guesses. You have to draw some conclusions, because the author doesn't always write every single thing that happens in the story. Readers need to know that you can look for details and make guesses about the things that the author doesn't include in the story. So drawing a conclusion kind of is like making a guess that goes along with a story. It's not making a guess that is completely has nothing to do with the story, but it's something that, oh, if the author didn't say that, maybe he means this. So making those kind of educated guesses. So we'll look for those. The preview, the topic for the week is visual arts. Visual art is art that you can look at, like a drawing or a sculpture. Artists use different things to make visual art. Some use paint to create the art, others use metal, wood, or clay. Even yarn can be used to create art. In The Goat and the Rug, you will learn about the art of weaving a rug. The artist in the selection uses yarn to make colorful patterns in her rugs. So we have a whole bunch of different kinds of arts. So visual art is art that you can see, whereas like music is also an art. You can't really see music, you listen to it. So visual art is like painting, sculptures, those things that you can see. So our story this week is called The Goat in the Rug by Geraldine. The author is Charles L. Blood and Martin Link. This story is a narrative nonfiction. It tells a true story about a topic. A narrative means that it's a story. When we learn about stories, have characters, a setting, a plot, those things that we're looking for, where it happened, real things. Nonfiction means real, so instead of it being a fake story, it is going to be a real story. Instead of it being like, this is the fact I know about goats, this is another fact I know about goats, it's told like a story. The story is told by the goat. In this story, it's like her perspective. So it's not saying that the goat speaks and talks and tells her story. It's what the author thinks the goat might have thought about all of this. My name is Geraldine, and I live near a place called Window Rock with my Navajo friend Glen May. It's called Window Rock because it has a large round hole in it that looks like a window open to the sky. Glen May is called Glen May most of the time because it's easier to say than her Indian name, Gli Nazba. In English, that means something like female warrior, but she's really a Navajo weaver. I guess that's why one day she decided to weave me into a rug. So I already told you Geraldine is the goat, and Glen May is her owner, and she uses, she's gonna use Geraldine to weave a rug. I remember it was a warm, sunny afternoon. Glen May had spent most of the morning sharpening a large pair of scissors. I had no idea what she was going to use them for, but it didn't take me long to find out. Before I knew what was happening, I was on the ground, and Glen May was clipping off my wool in great long strands. It's called mohair, really. It didn't hurt at all, but I admit I kicked up my heels some. I'm very ticklish for a goat. I might have looked a little naked and silly afterwards, but my, did I feel nice and cool. So I decided to stick around and see what would happen next. So in here, the author says kicked up her heels. So when the author says kicked up her heels, it's meaning that she's moving around a lot. It also says she's ticklish, so she's kind of squirming around. Why do you think Glen May felt silly, or Geraldine felt silly after Glen May clipped her wool off? Because at the beginning, Geraldine is this fluffy goat, and Glen May comes along with the scissors and cuts all of her fur off. So she's saying she kind of looks naked and silly. Every year, a goat herder or a sheep herder will shear their goats or sheep, which means that they cut their hair off. It has to happen at least once a year, or the animal can get really sick. The first thing Glen May did was chop up roots from a yucca plant. The roots made a soapy, rich lather when she mixed them with water. She washed my wool in the suds until it was clean and white. After that, a little bit of me, you might say, was hung up in the sun to dry. When my wool was dry, Glen May took out 2 large square combs with many teeth. By combing my wool between these carding combs, as they're called, she removed any bits of twigs or burrs and straightened out the fibers. She told me it helped make a smoother yarn for spinning. So, these are the square combs. They look like brushes, and you put them together and you do this kind of back and forth, and it helps get out all of the like pieces of stick or like leaves that the goat has gotten in her wool as she's walked around. So it kind of cleans them out. It makes them really nice and soft. It also kind of separates it because wool is really dense and thick, and when you use the combs, it kind of makes it thinner and it makes it fluffy, so it looks like a cotton ball would look like. Then Glen May carefully started to spin my wool, one small bundle at a time, into yarn. I was beginning to find out it takes a long while to make a Navajo rug. Again and again, Glen May twisted and pulled the wool. Then she spun it around a long, thin stick she called a spindle. As she twisted and pulled and spun, the finer, stronger, and smoother the yarn became. So this is her spindle. And she's spinning the wool so how it's like really thick here, and she's spinning it and it's getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and then she's putting it on a spindle. Making it, once it spins, it says that it gets stronger. So she's making it stronger so it doesn't break when she makes it into a rug. A few days later, Glen May and I went for a walk. She said we were going to find some special plants she would use to make dye. I didn't know what dye meant, but it sounded like a picnic to me. I do love to eat plants. That's what got me into trouble. So her list says rabbit bush, wild onion, cliff rose, sumac, juniper, walnuts, and dock. So those are the things on her list. So nowadays dyes are like made in a factory, but you can also make dyes out of the things you find outside. So like if you wanted a red dye, you could, back in the olden days, they would take red berries like raspberries or something, berries like that, raspberries, strawberries, those kinds of things, crush them up and make like a red dye to dye the clothes red. While Glen May was out looking for more plants, I ate everyone she had already collected in her bucket. Delicious. So, why do you think eating the plant, Geraldine got into trouble for eating the plants? I'm assuming it's because Glen May just spent all this time looking for these very specific plants, and Geraldine ate them all. So now she has to probably go and do it again. The next day, Glen May made me stay home while she walked miles to a store. She said the dye she could buy wasn't the same as the kind she makes from plants, but since I had made such a pig of myself, it would have to do. So Glen May has to go into town to get new dye because it seems to be that there's no more plants available to make that dye she was going to make. I was really worried that she would still be angry with me when she got back. She wasn't though, and pretty soon we had 3 big potfuls of dye boiling over a fire. Then I saw what Glen May had meant by dyeing. She dipped my white wool into one pot, and it turned pink. She dipped it again, it turned a darker pink. By the time she'd finished dipping it in and out and hung it up to dry, it was a beautiful, deep red. After that, she dyed some of my wool brown and some of it black. I couldn't help wondering if those plants I'd eaten would turn all of me the same colors. While I was worrying about that, Glenmay started to make our rug. She took a ball of yarn and wrapped it around and around 2 poles. I lost count when she'd reached 300 wraps. I guess I was too busy thinking about what it would be like to be the only red, white, black, and brown goat at Window Rock. It wasn't long before Glenmay had finished wrapping. Then she hung the poles with the yarn on a big wooden frame. It looked like a picture frame. Sorry, I'm gonna have to read this page again. So, it says, it wasn't long before Glenmay had finished wrapping. Then she hung the poles with the yarn on a big wooden frame. It looked like a picture frame made of logs. She called it a loom. After a whole week of getting ready to weave, Glenmay started. She began weaving at the bottom of the loom. Then 1 strand of yarn at a time, our rug started growing towards the top. So, most of my girls, I'm sure, have heard of loom bracelets. So it's in that same sense. So she has these 2 poles and strings going this way. She's going to put 1 strand of yarn here at the top, and she's going to use this stick to push it all the way down to the bottom to make a pattern. A few strands of black, a few of brown, a few of red, in and out, back and forth, until in a few days the pattern of her rug was clear to see. Our rug grew very slowly, just as every Navajo weaver before her had done for hundreds and hundreds of years. Glenmay formed a design that would never be duplicated. So it's saying that her design that Glenmay made was so unique that it would be hard for anybody to make a copy of it. A lot of these rugs are made so they can't be duplicated. A lot of times it's like a family design. So she made a rug that was unique to herself. Then at last the weaving was finished, but not until I'd checked it quite thoroughly in front and in back did I let Glenmay take our rug off the loom. So after each one of those strands, it made a complete rug. There was a lot of me in that rug. I wanted it to be perfect, and it was. Since then, my wool has grown almost long enough for Glenmay and me to make another rug. I hope we do very soon, because you see, there aren't too many weavers like Glenmay left among the Navajos. So it took Glenmay so long that Geraldine's already grown back most of her hair. So a lot of times the hair takes like 6 months to a year to grow back. So this rug has taken her about that same amount of time to make, which is a very long time. And it says there's not very many people like Glenmay left among the Navajos. So the Navajo Native Americans are still around, but they're kind of losing those old cultural things because it took a very long time for this to be made. And nowadays rugs are made really quickly in a store, and people are kind of losing those old things to do. I always think about my grandmother. She used to make clothes. She would sew clothes for her children, my dad and my mom. And nowadays, most people buy their clothes. I don't know how to sew clothes like that at all. So it's something that's kind of been lost because things got easier to do. So people kind of stopped doing them. And there's only one goat like me, Geraldine. So it says, this is the true story of a weaver and her goat who lived in the Navajo Nation at Window Rock Arizona. So this is something I see a lot of when I go down to visit my parents in Arizona. Are these kind of Native American things. Rugs, paintings, a lot of the stuff is themed towards that because that's where these people are from and lived for hundreds and thousands of years. And some of those things are still around. They're really pretty. So after you have listened to the story, you can reread it and remember to do those pages in your orange write-in readers. You can look up these rugs on the internet and maybe even do a little craft. If you have some yarn at home, you can make like a picture using the yarn and some glue to make something like yarn art. So I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I will see you again next week.